Welcome to The Explainer. For decades we thought we had a pretty solid picture of how memory works. But it turns out a really strange neurological puzzle has forced scientists to completely redraw the map. Today we're going to dive into the evidence that's redefining the very line between a fleeting thought and a memory that lasts forever.
Really think about it for a second. Right now, you're holding the beginning of this sentence in your head just so you can understand the end of it. Or maybe you're trying to remember a phone number someone just told you. What is actually physically happening inside your brain that lets you keep that information online and ready to go?
Well, for a long time, the classic analogy has been a workbench and a warehouse. Your working memory, that's the workbench. It's this small, active space where you can juggle a few things at once, maybe 3 or 4 items for whatever you're doing right now. And then you've got your long-term memory, which is like this massive, endless warehouse. It's where everything else gets stored away until you need to pull it out again.
It's a really useful model, right? But here's the problem. The edge between the workbench and the warehouse has always been, a little fuzzy. It's been tough for scientists to definitively say, okay, at this exact moment, that memory left the workbench and went into the warehouse. And that little bit of fuzziness led to a pretty major scientific mystery.
Yeah, this ambiguity created a fascinating puzzle that really challenged the whole idea of what it means to hold something in mind. And it all kicked off with a really clever experiment.
So back in 2012, researchers had people remember 2 different things, like a word and a face. Then they'd give them a little hint, saying, okay, get ready, we're going to test you on the word first. And when they did that, the brain activity, the actual electrical signal for the face, just poof, it vanished, gone.
But here's the crazy part. Even though the signal was completely gone, people could still remember the face perfectly fine a few seconds later if they were asked. So if the active electrical trace of the memory isn't there, but the memory itself still is, how in the world is the brain storing it? This one finding kicked off a huge debate about something called activity-silent working memory.
Okay, so to solve this mystery, scientists needed a smoking gun. They needed some kind of reliable, measurable brain signal that they could point to and say, yep, that right there, that is working memory in action. A true real-time indicator of information being held on that mental workbench.
And after a whole lot of searching, they found an incredibly strong candidate, a very specific type of brainwave that acts as a near-perfect neural fingerprint for the stuff we're actively thinking about. It's called the contralateral delay activity, or CDA for short. Now that sounds super technical, but in simple terms, it's just this steady electrical signal that pops up in your brain that we can measure with an EEG. And the key word here is sustained. It stays on, like a light switch, for as long as you're actively holding something in your mind. Okay, and this is where it gets really cool. Look at how this CDA signal behaves. It gets stronger when you remember one thing, stronger again for 2, and even stronger for 3. But then, it just flatlines. It hits a hard ceiling right around 3 or 4 items, which, what do you know, is the exact capacity limit that decades of research have told us is the max for our working memory. It's a perfect match.
So the crucial point here is that this signal checks all the boxes. It perfectly tracks how much stuff you're holding, it respects that strict capacity limit, and get this, how strong the signal is can even predict how well you'll actually remember something. It makes the CDA an amazing tool for finally drawing a clear line around that mental workbench.
All right, so now that we're armed with this solid marker for active working memory, we can go back to our original mystery. What about those memories where the electrical signal just disappears? If the CDA is the signature for online stuff, then what's happening when it's not there?
The authors of the paper we're looking at today propose a pretty bold but really simple idea. They argue that this activity-silent memory isn't some new kind of working memory at all. Instead, they say that when you have to recall one of these silent memories, the process leaves behind the classic fingerprints of pulling something out of the warehouse, out of long-term memory.
And one of the clearest of these fingerprints is something called retrieval practice. You know this feeling. It's the simple fact that the very act of trying to remember something, of pulling it out of storage, actually makes that memory stronger and easier to recall later on. So if these silent items are really being pulled from long-term memory, we should see this exact effect.
And a brilliant experiment back in 2014 illustrates this perfectly. It was specifically designed to hunt for this exact long-term memory fingerprint inside what looked like a short-term memory task. And the setup was beautifully simple.
So they had people remember a single word for a few seconds. Sometimes they could just repeat it in their head. But on other trials, bam, they got hit with a distracting math problem that completely took up their attention, forcing that word right off their mental workbench. Then at the very end of the whole thing, they gave everyone a surprise pop quiz to recall all the words they'd seen.
And the results were just stunning and totally the opposite of what you'd think. People were significantly better at remembering the words that were interrupted by the math task, better than the words they were actually allowed to sit there and actively rehearse. How weird is that?
This right here, this is the smoking gun. That result is a textbook example of the long-term memory retrieval practice effect. The distraction forced the brain to shove the word into the warehouse. Then, to answer the question, the brain had to pull it back out. And that single act of retrieval strengthened the memory, making it way easier to recall on the final surprise test. The long-term memory fingerprint was there the whole time.
So this evidence doesn't just solve the little mystery of the vanishing signal. It lets us draw a much cleaner, much more useful map of how our memory systems actually work together.
It all leads to this really elegant online-offline model. The big idea is that the true dividing line between what's on your mental workbench and what's in your warehouse isn't about time or how important something is. It's just about the physical presence of persistent, measurable brain activity. This gives us a super clean, simple definition. If your brain is actively firing neurons and using up electrical energy to maintain some piece of information, that information is online in working memory. The second that activity stops, that info has been offloaded to the offline, silent storage of long-term memory, just waiting to be pulled out again. So the big takeaway here is that activity silent storage isn't some mysterious third type of memory. It's just the brain doing what it does best, seamlessly and incredibly efficiently working between its active workbench and its huge warehouse, constantly shifting information from online to offline to deal with whatever life is throwing at it. This new, clearer definition gives scientists a powerful way to watch this beautiful dance between our memory systems in real time. But it also leaves us with a deeper, maybe more philosophical question to chew on. If the contents of our consciousness, our active thoughts, are defined by these persistent electrical signals, what becomes of our self in those silent gaps in between them?